When looking at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, that was the treaty that formalized the defeat of the Russian Empire to the German Empire in World War I. It's often seen as extremely unreasonably harsh. The Russians pretty much had to relinquish claims to Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and the Caucasus. This makes Versailles look amazing, but what a lot of people don't know is that this wasn't the first treaty offered by the Germans. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was very harsh. There's no doubt about that. But it was harsh not for the reasons you think. Not in the way that Versailles was. Russia had to give up all this land because Germany was trying to scare other nations into accepting a peace treaty. So it makes a little more sense if you take a look at the first treaty offered to the Russians by Germany. Russia would have only had to relinquish these lands in gray. They were to give independence to Poland and Lithuania, which would, of course, be ruled by German princes. And the Bolsheviks were considering accepting this treaty because it really wasn't that harsh of a treaty. But again, the Bolsheviks were still fighting a civil war. And they didn't really want the Russian people. Again, the Russian people wouldn't be very happy if Russia dropped out of the war on Germany's terms. The Russian people wanted to drop out of the war, but they didn't really want to lose a ton of land. And the Bolsheviks wanted to show that they were strong. So the Bolsheviks didn't accept this treaty, and instead pursued quite possibly the worst battle strategy in history. They just stopped fighting. No joke, the Bolsheviks retreated and left their front wide open, and you'll never guess what Germany did. They took all this land, as well as the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire took it too. So when Germany took all this land, the Bolsheviks realized, which I don't know how they didn't realize ahead of time, but they realized that they screwed up really bad by doing that. And Germany now demanded all this land. And the Bolsheviks had no choice but to accept because they had pretty much disbanded their armies. So if they didn't accept this one, then Germans would have come marching into the Russian heartland. For Germany, this treaty was amazing. It was a national pride, which less than a year later would be totally humiliated. The German people were extremely, extremely proud of this treaty. The Germans were hoping that this treaty would show other nations what would happen if they didn't offer peace early. They were hoping it would get France to surrender because France would see this and say, hey, if I just surrender early, if Russia had surrendered early, they wouldn't have had to give up that much. So the Germans were hoping it would scare people into surrendering, which no, it did not. If anything, they only started fighting harder. For Russia, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was an absolute humiliation. It made the Bolsheviks extremely unpopular. They did end the war, but not in the way that the people had wanted. The people had wanted an end to the war, but they didn't want an end to the war that humiliated their nation. And on top of that, the land that Russia had to relinquish was a lot of their coal industry, which meant all those jobs were now fueling the German economy, not the Russian economy. So the Russian economy went in the toilet. Russia would end up getting some, but not all of those lands back during the Russian Civil War and after Germany collapsed, the German Empire collapsed. But the treaty was still seen and is seen as a humiliation by Russians. Some lands that they lost in the treaty, the Russians would never get back, like Poland or Finland. Others they got back right after the war, like Ukraine, Belarus, and the Caucasus. But the Baltic states, the Soviet Union, didn't annex until World War II. So this treaty did irreversible damage to Russia or the Soviet Union. So again, the reason the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was so hard was because the Germans were sick of fighting the Russians. They had offered up this treaty, which, in my eyes, isn't that unreasonable. Like, Germany was fighting a hard two-front war, and for them to just have a small buffer zone in the east between them and Russia, I don't think this was that unreasonable of a treaty. But the Bolsheviks declined it. So then they had to pay the price, which was this. They ended up getting about half of it back after World War One. So yeah, this is why the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was so harsh. And again, this is why you really can't compare it. Well, a lot of people who defend the Treaty of Versailles say, well, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was really hard, was really harsh, but you can't really compare it because the Germans offered up this treaty way earlier, and the Bolsheviks could have easily accepted this treaty and probably moved on with their lives, and the people probably wouldn't have been that upset with them. But what the treaty maybe did accomplish is if the Russians accepted this treaty, then Germany almost immediately probably could have moved their troops over to the Western Front. Whereas the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, it ended up being a pain in the butt for Russia because, well, Russia, it was a pain in the butt for Russia because they had to reconquer afterwards. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk ended up being a pain in the butt for Germany, most of all, because Germany had to then take all those lands, occupy them, and maintain order there. And that was costing them valuable resources that they should have been using to fight on the Western Front. So really, I think everyone would have benefited, including Germany and Russia, if they had just accepted the earlier one. But that's why the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was so harsh.